The alarm shrieked through Voss Dynamics headquarters like a death sentence, and Billionaire CEO Dorian Voss watched his entire empire collapse in real time across 20 blood-red screens. Every investor, every reporter, every doubter was watching the launch fail catastrophically, and he couldn't stop it. His company, his reputation, his legacy, all drowning in cascading system errors. The engineers were panicking, the security chief was frozen, and Dorian felt his chest tighten with a fear he hadn't known in 20 years. Then a quiet voice cut through the chaos. A waitress in a coffee-stained uniform pointing at a screen no one else had noticed, and suddenly everything changed. What could a waitress possibly know that a room full of brilliant engineers missed? This is where everything truly began. Dorian Voss stood in the center of the marble-floored executive lounge on the 48th floor of his Manhattan headquarters, and for the first time in his entire career, he felt genuine terror crawling up his spine. The crystal chandeliers above reflected perfectly off the polished Italian marble, the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering New York skyline, and everything looked exactly as expensive and flawless as it should, but none of that mattered anymore because his company was dying right in front of him. The launch of Cyphergate 1, the security platform he'd spent 3 years and $2 billion building, was supposed to happen in exactly 90 minutes, and instead every screen in the building was flashing red error messages that made his stomach twist into knots. He pressed both hands flat against the glass conference table, trying to steady himself, trying to think clearly through the panic that was threatening to take over completely. His head of security, Caleb Wren, stood beside him with sweat beading on his forehead despite the perfectly controlled air conditioning, frantically typing commands that weren't doing anything at all. The other engineers clustered around their laptops looked just as lost, just as scared, and Dorian realized with a sickening clarity that nobody in this room knew how to fix what was happening. They were supposed to be the best. He'd hired them because they were supposed to be brilliant. And right now they were all useless. "Talk to me, Caleb," Dorian said, and he hated how his voice shook slightly on the last word. He was Dorian Voss. He didn't shake. He didn't panic. He'd built this company from nothing, turned it into a $5 billion empire, and he wasn't supposed to feel like a helpless child watching his sandcastle wash away. But that's exactly what this felt like, watching everything he'd built dissolve into nothing while he stood there unable to stop it. Caleb looked up, his face pale and drawn. "It's a breach, but I can't trace it. Every defensive protocol we activate crashes within seconds. It's like the system is fighting itself. I've never seen anything like this." His fingers flew across the keyboard again, desperate, frantic. "We're losing primary servers one by one. If this continues, we won't have a launch. We won't have anything." Dorian felt his chest tighten. The investor reception was already gathering in the grand ballroom 3 floors down, hundreds of people in designer suits and diamond jewelry, drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week, waiting to witness the revolutionary launch that was going to change cybersecurity forever. Major news outlets had cameras set up. His biggest competitors were probably watching online, waiting to see him succeed or fail. And right now, failure was the only option on the table. He thought about the contracts hanging in the balance, government deals, corporate partnerships, military applications, all of them contingent on tonight's successful demonstration. He thought about his board of directors, several of whom had opposed this launch timeline, who would use this disaster to push him out of his own company. He thought about his ex-wife's smug voice echoing in his memory, telling him he cared more about his empire than anything real, and how she'd been right all along because here he was, watching that empire crumble and feeling like his entire identity was crumbling with it. "Keep trying," Dorian said, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. What else could he say? Give up? Accept defeat? He turned away from the screens because looking at them was making him feel physically ill, and that's when he noticed Lena Ward standing near the coffee counter, watching everything with quiet, observant eyes. Lena was one of the catering staff, a waitress who worked the executive floors, keeping the coffee fresh and the pastries arranged during long meetings. Dorian had probably seen her 100 times without really seeing her at all, the way you don't really see wallpaper or furniture. She wore the standard catering uniform, black pants and a white button-down shirt with the company logo embroidered small on the pocket, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked completely unremarkable, completely ordinary, and yet something about the way she was looking at the screens made him pause. "You saw something," Dorian said, more statement than question, walking toward her with quick, purposeful steps. Several engineers glanced up, confused about why their CO was suddenly talking to the waitress, but Dorian ignored them completely. He'd built his fortune on instinct, on reading people, on noticing things others missed, and right now his instinct was screaming that this unassuming woman had information he needed. Lena looked startled, like she hadn't expected to be noticed at all, but she didn't back away. "Earlier," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious nerves, "about 20 minutes ago, I was using the tablet at the counter to log the coffee inventory, and something weird happened. The screen flashed, just for a second, with lines of code I didn't understand, then went back to normal. I thought maybe it was just a glitch, but—" She hesitated, glancing at the red screaming monitors. But it felt wrong. Like something was trying to push through and got blocked. Dorian felt his heart rate spike, not with panic this time but with something sharper: focus. "Show me exactly what you saw." He grabbed her arm, gently but urgently, and pulled her toward the nearest workstation. Caleb started to protest, started to say something about how they didn't have time for irrelevant distractions, but Dorian shut him down with a single cutting look that made the security chief go silent immediately. Lena pulled up the cafe management tablet, her hands moving quickly across the screen. "Here," she said, pulling up the system logs. "Right here at 6:47 p.m. The screen went dark for maybe half a second, showed this. She pointed at a string of code that meant nothing to Dorian but made Caleb lean in sharply, and then went back to the inventory page like nothing happened. Caleb stared at the code, his face transforming from frustrated exhaustion to intense concentration. "That's not a glitch," he said slowly, and Dorian could hear the wheels turning in the man's head. "That's an authentication handshake request. Something tried to connect to our network through this device and got temporarily blocked by the firewall before." He stopped, his eyes going wide. "Before it found another way in." "What other way?" Dorian demanded, moving closer, feeling like they were finally getting somewhere. The terror in his chest was still there, still crushing, but now it was mixed with something else. A thin, fragile thread of hope. Caleb was already pulling up deeper system logs, his fingers flying faster than Dorian had ever seen. "Microchannels," he breathed. "We have dozens of tiny data pathways for routine background processes, system updates, diagnostic checks, maintenance protocols. They're considered too small and too restricted to be exploited, so we don't monitor them as heavily as the main ports." He pulled up a new screen and went absolutely still. "Oh God, there's a tunnel here." Someone opened a microchannel tunnel and they're using it to flood the system with mirrored requests. The other engineers crowded around now, all talking at once, voices rising in a cacophony of technical jargon that made Dorian's head spin. But through it all, he kept his eyes on Lena, this quiet waitress who'd noticed something every highly paid expert had missed. She stood there looking uncomfortable with all the attention, but she didn't leave, didn't fade into the background the way she probably wanted to. "Can you close the tunnel?" Dorian asked Caleb, trying to keep his voice level, trying not to show how desperately he needed the answer to be yes. Caleb tried. 5 agonizing minutes, he tried everything: manual shutdown commands, automated kill switches, firewall overrides, and nothing worked. Every attempt bounced back like hitting a steel wall. The mirrored requests kept flooding in, thousands every second, forcing Cyphergate 1 to essentially attack itself while trying to defend against the phantom threat. It was brilliant and terrifying, and they were losing. Dorian felt the hope draining out of him again, felt the crushing weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. He thought about walking into that ballroom and announcing that there would be no launch, that his revolutionary platform had been destroyed before it could even go live, that everyone who'd bet against him had been right all along. He thought about the humiliation, the financial devastation, the end of everything he'd worked for. His hands were shaking again and he couldn't make them stop. Then Lena spoke, quiet but clear. "It's copying you." Everyone turned to look at her. Caleb frowned. "What?" Lena pointed at the screen showing the mirrored requests flooding through the system. "Look at the timestamps," she said. "Each mirrored request comes in a fraction of a second after your real system generates a response. It's not breaking in, it's waiting for you to do something and then copying it. Like an echo." She looked at Caleb, then at Dorian, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I might be completely wrong, but it looks like the attack needs your system to respond first. Without that, it doesn't know what to copy." The room went dead silent. Dorian watched Caleb's face transform as the idea sank in, watched the moment of realization hit like lightning. "It's parasitic," Caleb whispered, and suddenly he was typing again, but differently now, not frantically, not desperately, but with precision and purpose. "If we create a silent zone, a few seconds where the system generates 0 responses, the attack will stall because it'll have nothing to mirror." "Will that kill it?" Dorian asked, barely breathing. "No," Caleb said, pulling up command windows faster than Dorian could follow. "But it'll give us a window to inject a kill switch directly into the tunnel. If we time it right, we can use the attack's own feedback loop against itself." Dorian looked at Lena, really looked at her, and saw intelligence and observation and courage in someone he'd walked past 100 times without seeing. "Do it," he told Caleb. Then to Lena, "Stay here. I need to know if you see anything else." The next 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Caleb initiated the silent zone protocol, and every screen in the executive lounge went completely dark. The sudden absence of light and sound was shocking, almost physical, like the building itself was holding its breath. Dorian stood frozen beside Lena, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, counting seconds in his head because Caleb had said they had maybe 5 seconds before the entire system would interpret the silence as a fatal error and shut down completely. 5 seconds to save everything or lose it all. The room felt suffocating despite its enormous size, despite the city lights glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Dorian realized his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, Lena was staring at the blank screens with an intensity that surprised him. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't looking away, wasn't making nervous small talk the way people usually did when they were out of their depth. She was watching, observing, ready, and Dorian found himself grateful for her steady presence in a way he couldn't quite explain. Everyone else in the room was an expert, a specialist, someone whose entire career had led them to this moment, and yet somehow this waitress felt like the calmest person here. The screens flickered back to life, and for one terrible second Dorian thought they'd failed, thought the red error messages would return, thought everything was over. But instead the displays showed clean, stable system readouts. Green indicators where there had been red warnings. Steady data flow where there had been chaos. "The mirrored requests are stalling," Caleb said, his voice tight with concentration, fingers still flying across the keyboard. "They're waiting for something to copy. Injecting kill switch now." Dorian watched lines of code stream across the central monitor, moving so fast he couldn't begin to understand what they meant. He felt completely helpless, completely dependent on other people's expertise, and he hated that feeling with an intensity that made his jaw ache. He'd spent his entire adult life making sure he was never at someone else's mercy, never powerless, never vulnerable, and right now he was all three at once. The only thing keeping him from completely falling apart was the knowledge that giving in to panic wouldn't help anyone. "It's working," one of the junior engineers whispered, and Dorian heard desperate hope in those 2 words. Several others leaned closer to their screens, not daring to speak, as if sound itself might somehow break whatever fragile progress they'd made. Then the central screen flashed green, and Caleb let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "The tunnel's collapsing. The attack is feeding back on itself. It's shutting down at the source." His hands dropped to his sides and he just stared at the monitor like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "It's over. The breach is closed. Cyphergate 1 is stable." The room erupted. Engineers were hugging each other, shouting with relief, laughing and talking over each other in a rush of released tension that filled the space with chaotic energy. Dorian stood perfectly still, letting the news sink in slowly, letting himself believe it was real. His company wasn't destroyed. The launch could still happen. Everything he'd built wasn't gone. The relief was so intense it almost hurt, a physical sensation spreading through his chest and making his eyes burn in a way he absolutely would not acknowledge. He turned to Lena, who'd taken a small step back from all the celebration, looking like she wanted to slip away unnoticed now that the crisis was over. Dorian caught her arm gently before she could disappear. "You saved this company," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Every expert in this room missed what you saw." "How?" Lena looked uncomfortable with the direct attention, but she met his eyes steadily. "I don't know anything about cybersecurity," she admitted. "But I've worked in restaurants and cafes for 8 years, and you learn to notice patterns. When the espresso machine sounds wrong, when the walk-in cooler temperature drops slightly, when something's just off even if you can't explain why. That flash on the tablet felt wrong. That's all." She gave a small, self-conscious shrug. "I almost didn't say anything because I figured you'd all think I was wasting your time." "You weren't wasting anything," Dorian said firmly. "You were paying attention when it mattered." He glanced at Caleb, who was still running final diagnostics but listening to their conversation. "How long until we can launch?" "We need 30 minutes to run full system checks and verify everything's clean," Caleb said, looking exhausted but relieved. "But yeah, we can still launch tonight." Dorian made a decision in that moment, the kind of instinctive choice that had served him well throughout his career. "Lena, you're coming to the launch presentation. Not as catering staff, as my guest." Lena's eyes went wide. "Mr. Voss, I can't, I'm working and I'm not dressed for." "You're dressed fine," Dorian interrupted. "And I'm the CEO, which means I decide who attends my company's launch." He softened his tone slightly, recognizing that he was being intense and probably overwhelming her. "You saved everything tonight. The least I can do is make sure you're there to see what you saved." 30 minutes later, Dorian stood on the stage in the grand ballroom, looking out at hundreds of faces lit by the glow of the massive screens displaying Cyphergate 1's interface. The presentation had gone flawlessly. The demonstration had been perfect. The system that had nearly died an hour ago was now performing beautifully for an audience that had no idea how close they'd come to witnessing a catastrophic failure instead of a triumph. When the presentation concluded to thunderous applause, Dorian did something he hadn't planned. He asked Lena to join him on stage. She looked terrified, shaking her head, but he gave her an encouraging nod and she slowly made her way up the side steps, looking completely out of place among the designer suits and expensive jewelry but walking with quiet dignity. "Tonight almost didn't happen," Dorian told the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. "We faced a sophisticated cyber attack minutes before launch, and it was stopped because someone who isn't a cybersecurity expert, who isn't an engineer, who doesn't have an advanced degree in computer science, noticed something everyone else missed." He gestured to Lena, who stood beside him looking like she wanted the floor to swallow her. Lena Ward saw a pattern that saved this entire company. She's proof that intelligence and observation matter more than titles or credentials. The applause that followed was genuine, and Dorian saw several investors and journalists looking at Lena with new interest and respect. She handled it with grace despite her obvious discomfort, giving a small nod of acknowledgement before stepping back to let Dorian finish his remarks. After the official presentation ended, the ballroom dissolved into smaller conversations as investors and partners mingled over champagne and elaborately decorated desserts. Dorian found Lena standing near one of the tall windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You handled that well," he said, joining her at the window. She glanced at him, then back at the city lights. "I wasn't expecting any of that. This whole night feels surreal." "It was surreal," Dorian agreed. "I've been building this company for 15 years, and I've never been that close to losing everything." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about how differently this night could have ended. "I want to offer you something." Lena looked wary. "Mr. Voss." "A position in our operations analysis team," Dorian continued. "Not out of charity or because I feel obligated, but because you demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking we need, the ability to see patterns others miss, to stay calm under pressure, to speak up when something's wrong even when you're surrounded by people who supposedly know better." Lena was silent for several long seconds, And Dorian could see her processing the offer, weighing it carefully. "I don't have the education," she finally said. "I dropped out of college after a year because I couldn't afford it. I don't have any relevant experience or credentials." "You have observation skills that saved a multi-billion-dollar company," Dorian countered. "We can teach technical knowledge. We can't teach instinct." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Think about it. Take as much time as you need. But I meant what I said on that stage. Intelligence isn't defined by degrees." Lena took the card, holding it carefully between her fingers. "Why does this matter so much to you? You barely know me." Dorian considered the question, recognizing that she deserved an honest answer. "Because I've spent my entire career surrounding myself with people who had the right credentials, the right education, the right pedigree. And tonight, when everything was falling apart, none of that mattered. What mattered was someone who paid attention and had the courage to speak up." He looked out at the glittering city. "This company almost died tonight because we were so convinced of our own expertise that we missed something obvious. That's not a mistake I'm going to repeat." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city together. Eventually Lena excused herself, saying she needed to finish her shift and that the catering team would wonder where she'd gone. Dorian watched her disappear into the crowd, this unlikely person who'd changed everything, and felt something shift in how he thought about success and value and what really mattered. 2 weeks later, Lena called the number on his card and accepted the position. Dorian assigned her to work with Caleb's team, and within 3 months she'd identified 2 other potential vulnerabilities that the engineering team had overlooked. She approached problems differently than everyone else, seeing patterns and connections that technical training sometimes obscured rather than revealed. Dorian never forgot that night. The terror of watching his empire collapse, the helplessness of not being able to fix it himself, and the unexpected salvation from someone he'd never thought to really see. It changed how he hired, how he listened, and how he valued different kinds of intelligence. And though Lena never became his romantic partner or his closest friend, she became something equally important. A reminder that wisdom and insight don't always come from the places or people you expect, and that sometimes the person who saves you is someone you've walked past 100 times without noticing they were extraordinary all along. Sometimes the person who saves you isn't the one with the most credentials or the biggest title, but the one who simply pays attention when everyone else is too busy to notice. Dorian learned that night that intelligence shows up in unexpected places, worn by people in simple uniforms who see patterns others miss because they've learned to observe the world carefully. Lena never became a billionaire or a CEO, but she found work that challenged her mind and respected her instincts, and that was worth more than any title could have given her. And in a marble-floored office high above Manhattan, a man who'd almost lost everything remembered forever the waitress who'd noticed a flicker no one else thought mattered. If you want more stories of unexpected heroes and life-changing moments, explore our channel for tales that'll move your heart. Have you ever noticed something important that everyone else missed? Share your story in the comments. Like/share/subscribe. If this story touched you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more emotional journeys every week. Thanks for loving Reddit Storyteller.